Creighton's Ryan Kalkbrenner, San Diego State's Lamont Butler, and Auburn's Johni Broome are all returning to school for the 2023-2024 college basketball season. Which program is most impacted by this news? Let's discuss.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Andy Patton, and we got three NBA draft declaration decisions to talk about today, specifically three players who have decided to return to school for next season as opposed to staying in the NBA draft process. Of course, those three players, Ryan Kalkbrenner from Creighton, Johni Broome from Auburn, and Lamont Butler from San Diego State. We're going to talk about all three of those players individually, what their return means for their program, what else has happened with that program, and how it might help that team continue going forward. We're going to start talking about Kalkbrenner, a two-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year. Kalkbrenner averaged just under 16 points per game last year for the Blue Jays, about 6 boards, just over 2 blocks per game. He was one of the most efficient low-post scorers in the entire country. He shot 72% on two-pointers. 72%. And we're not talking about a tiny, minuscule sample size. He was getting the rock frequently for Creighton. Drew Timme didn't put up 72% from the field. Oscar Tshiebwe didn't put up 72% from the field. This is one of the most efficient low-post scorers in the country. Kalkbrenner has also been working on developing an outside shot. He was about 31.5% last year from three. Probably part of the reason he's coming back to school. Obviously, he kind of fits the archetype of a lot of those guys who are very good college players but don't necessarily translate in the NBA. For Kalkbrenner, if that three-point shooting becomes more consistent, that is the kind of thing that is going to help dramatically boost his NBA draft stock from being a fringe two-way, maybe not sticking on an NBA roster type guy, to being a guy who actually ends up being in a rotation. There's some other stuff that Kalkbrenner has to work on too, a little bit of some size stuff, potentially some physicality, things of that nature. But Kalkbrenner was a 31.5% three-point shooter last year, while also shooting just about 80% from the free throw line. So I think there's some optimism that for Kalkbrenner, the three-point shot could come, could develop, could show up in a more consistent game basis, which is what scouts are going to want to see from him. But speaking on Kalkbrenner specifically and what it means for Creighton, I mean, this is a huge player to get back, not just literally in the sense that he is a very big player, but Creighton has kind of had a pretty tumultuous offseason. Right now, the only other player who's significant from last year's roster who is guaranteed to return outside of Kalkbrenner is Baylor Scheierman. Scheierman, of course, South Dakota State transfer, who was tremendous for the Blue Jays last year. Very, very good outside shooter, but more of a do-it-all guard. Big guard, 6'6", 6'7", can score from deep, can also take the ball to the hoop, decent defender, good distributor, all of that stuff. Really critical for Creighton and Greg McDermott to get Scheierman back. They also get Kalkbrenner back. But at the start of the offseason, if you told Creighton fans that those are the only two guys they're really getting back, I'm not sure they would have been all that happy with it. And I can't say that I blame them. Ryan Nembhard was a stunning addition into the NCAA transfer portal. He, of course, has decided to follow in his footsteps of his older brother, Andrew, and is joining Mark Few and the Zags over in Spokane. Arthur Kaluma was one of the last players to enter the transfer portal before the window closed on May 11th. He was a big part of what Creighton did last year, and it is a big loss for McDermott's team to not have him back, unless, of course, he chooses to come back. And then, speaking of players who may or may not come back to Creighton, you have Trey Alexander. And so much of the conversation around Creighton at this stage of the offseason will depend on what happens with Alexander. Now, of course, we're talking here, you're listening to this on May 30th. By the time you're listening, it's possible Alexander has already made an announcement on whether he is going to return to Creighton and play with Kalkbrenner and Scheierman, or whether he's going to stay in the NBA draft process. If Alexander returns and you get Scheierman and Alexander and Kalkbrenner back, suddenly you feel a lot better. Yes, you still have the loss of Nembhard, you still have the loss of Kaluma, but Creighton has made strides to improve those areas after losing those players. Namely, the biggest addition that they have made so far this offseason is Stephen Ashworth. Stephen Ashworth is a star point guard from Utah State. He entered the transfer portal, was also connected to Gonzaga, was also connected to a handful of other places like Arizona. When Nembhard committed to Gonzaga, the dominoes kind of began to fall, and one of those was Ashworth ending up at Creighton. He's a 41% three-point shooter last year for the Aggies. A really solid addition for McDermott's team to help replicate Nembhard. Is he the same player? No, but he has enough skill to be a high quality starting point guard in the Big East. And he's a better floor spacer. He's a better 3-point shooter than Nembhard. That should open up the floor a little bit more. Frankly, that actually helps Kalkbrenner pretty significantly in opening up the lanes, giving him more room to operate down on the block. It also helps Shireman be able to cut to the basket more. It creates some more opportunities for the rest of the players on Creighton's team. Of course, you don't have as good of a facilitator in Nembhard because he's a really good facilitator, but Ashworth is a more than capable replacement in that spot. The other additions they've made, Jonathan Lawson comes over from Memphis. He didn't play much last year for the Tigers, but he's a 6'6" guard, former top 100 prospect. I think he's a guy that maybe you don't rely on him. You know, he's not going to fill Arthur Kaluma's role in year one. That would be way too much to ask of the young man, but he's a good developmental piece for Coach McDermott and a guy that I think is going to have a very nice career at Creighton if he's willing to stick it out for a couple of seasons. They also had Isaac Trout from Virginia, 6'10" power forward, did not play last year, but a guy who could come in and give this team some quality minutes next season. They also have two incoming players in the class of 2023. One of them is an unranked center named Brock Weiss. The other one is Josiah Dotzler. He is a 3-star guard in the class of 2023, comes in just inside the top 250. That's at 24/7 Sports' composite rankings. So Creighton getting Kalkbrenner back is huge. They did not have an obvious replacement for him. This is not a Adama Sanogo, Donovan Clingan situation going on at UConn. This is we need Kalkbrenner back again. 2-time defensive player of the year in the Big East, will be in the running to be the defensive player of the year in all of college basketball next season, especially if Zach Edey does not come back. This is a very likely outcome for Kalkbrenner next year with the Blue Jays. A team that I think, again, we're still waiting on Trey Alexander. If Alexander comes back, I think that this team competes to be a top 3 team in the Big East alongside Marquette, alongside UConn, of course, alongside Xavier. They'll be in that conversation. And a top 3 or 4 team in the Big East, based on how the Big East did last year, that potentially nets you a top 5 seed in the NCAA tournament. And I think absolutely Creighton, especially with Alexander back, is the kind of team that competes to be a 3 seed, 4 seed, 5 seed, 6 seed like they were last year. That was a little bit disappointing for them, in part because Kalkbrenner missed a few weeks. He missed a little bit of time with mono. Creighton went on a losing streak during that period of time. It hurt them. Come March, they got lower seeded than they should have been. Everybody who followed college basketball who saw Creighton get a 6 seed last year thought, that seems like the kind of team that might be able to pull off an upset over a 3 seed. Sure enough, they got their chance against Baylor. They beat Baylor. They moved all the way to the Elite Eight. Were a very, very soft foul call away from advancing even farther than that. The foul, of course, by Ryan Nembhard on Darion Trammell from San Diego State. I think the right decision for Kalkbrenner. I understand why he'd want to come back, work on some of those skills that he hasn't quite displayed consistently at the college level. If Creighton can get Alexander to come out of the draft process and do the same, they'll have 3 key pieces from last year's roster, adding in a really big-time player in Ashworth. And suddenly, I think you're right back in the thick of being one of the best teams in the Big East and potentially one of the best teams, quite honestly, in all of college basketball. Well, Lamont Butler hit one of the biggest shots in NCAA tournament history last year. Only got that chance because of that foul from Ryan Nembhard that we just spoke about. Butler is now going to return for another go-round with the Aztecs. More on what that means for San Diego State after a word from today's sponsor, Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack, but you don't want all of the sugar and calories, then you need the best tasting protein bar ever built. Built Bars are healthy and they taste amazing. Seriously, they taste so good that you will not think that they are healthy for you. What makes them taste so good? Well, for starters, they are covered in 100% real dark chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and cookies and cream. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. They only have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't have to wait around to get a box. For years, we have been talking about getting your Built Bars at Built.com, but now you can buy them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club while you can still get those specialty flavors at Built.com. So head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puff. And if you're close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, brownie batter puff and churro puff. You can thank me later. Built Bar, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. Happy to report we have hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which means the next time that you see my co-host Isaac Shade on YouTube, he will look a little bit different, as he has promised to shave his head when we get to that 1,000 subscriber mark. Appreciate every single one of you who has made this show your first listen of the day. Again, thank you so much to those everyday listeners out there who check us out every single day. We got way more stuff coming this week as we continue to talk about NBA draft declarations, players who stay in the draft, players who do not stay in the draft, what it means for college basketball, what it means for those individuals as they potentially move on in their careers. We're going to cover all of that stuff extensively throughout the next week and leading up to the NBA draft. We talked Ryan Kalkbrenner and Creighton in the first segment. We're going to now talk about Lamont Butler and the Aztecs of San Diego State. Butler may not appear from a stats perspective, like the back of a basketball card numbers, to be as impactful of a returner as Broome or as Kalkbrenner, the other two guys we're talking about. But don't tell San Diego State fans that, because, man, Lamont Butler was a critical piece for this team last year, not just because he hit one of the biggest shots in NCAA tournament history, although we'll admit that that certainly helped raise his profile and raise his kind of notoriety within the community in San Diego. Butler averaged 8.8 points per game last year, 2.7 boards, 3.2 assists, and 1.5 steals. He was a very, very good defensive guard for this team, shot about 47% from two, 34% from deep. He's always kind of been a bit of a streaky outside shooter, not the most consistent there. He was all Mountain West last year. He's a two-time Mountain West all defensive team. He was, of course, on the all tournament team last year. How could he not be after hitting that ridiculous game winner to end the tremendous streak from Florida Atlantic and send San Diego State to their first ever national championship appearance? It was one of the greatest shots I've ever witnessed live. One of the greatest shots many of you have ever witnessed live as well. The mid-range shot, Lamont Butler, right as the clock ran out. Really nice performance from him in that game. Really helped make what was a very, very fun and unique NCAA tournament even more fun. You always love the game winners, the buzzer beaters, and Lamont Butler delivered in a major way in that game. The big question now for San Diego State is, what are the odds of them repeating that kind of success? Certainly, you don't make the NCAA tournament national championship game every single year, but does San Diego State still have the pieces in order to make that kind of run? Lamont Butler returning is obviously a huge part. He returns alongside Darion Trammell, who was their starting point guard last year, had a really big game against Alabama in the NCAA tournament. They probably don't advance past the Crimson Tide without Trammell and what he did. You also get Jadon Ledee back. You also get Micah Parrish back. That's a huge part of your core that is all returning from last year's team. However, there are other big parts of the core that are not going to be back, and this is going to be up to Coach Brian Dutcher to figure out how to replicate and replace these really critical pieces. Matt Bradley is out of college eligibility. He has been in college for a very long time, began at Cal, of course, been at San Diego State for the last couple of years. He was the team's leading scorer last year. He is out the door. That is a tough, tough loss for this team. Keshad Johnson, who was a big enforcer for this team in the middle, power forward, could do a little bit of everything, really good defensive player, high energy player. He has transferred to join Tommy Lloyd and the Wildcats of Arizona. Nathan Mensah and Adam Seiko both graduate as well. This was a very old team last year. That was a huge talking point throughout the NCAA tournament. You everyday listeners heard Isaac and I talk about it a whole bunch in March, that experienced guard play wins in March. And San Diego State had it last year. They had it with Matthew Bradley. They had it with Adam Seiko. Mensah and Johnson were bigger guys, but they were both experienced guys as well. Of course, they had Butler and Trammell and Ledee and Parrish. And they still get some of those guys back, but losing Bradley really hurts. Losing the depth in the front court in Mensah and Johnson really hurts. Losing a depth piece like Seiko really hurts too. And so this team, they got some work to do. If they hadn't got Lamont Butler back, if he had stayed in the draft process, which would have been a little bit surprising. I want to be clear. This is of the announcements that we're making today. This is probably the least surprising. I don't think anybody's super shocked that Kalkbrenner's coming back either. Broome was maybe the one that was the most unsure what he was actually going to do. But Butler, it always kind of felt like he was going to come back to San Diego State. But still, this team has some work to do, even even with Butler back, with Trammell presumably back, with Leday and Parrish presumably back, barring a change of heart, that's a really nice core. But you got to supplement that with some talent around them. Fortunately, Brian Dutcher and co have already done so. One of the biggest additions that they made in the transfer portal was from USC, Reese Dixon Waters, incoming senior, spent the last 3 years with the Trojans. Not a shock to see him enter the portal. He entered the portal long before Bronny James committed to USC, but with their incoming class already being absolutely elite, with a couple of top tier 2023 prospects coming in, with Boogie Ellis making his intention to return to USC. There just wasn't a lot of room in that guard rotation for Dixon Waters to stick around. He enters the portal. He ends up joining Brian Dutcher in San Diego State. He averaged about 10 points per game last year, 3 rebounds, 6'5" guard. He's the kind of guy that fits at San Diego State. He's tough. He's physical. He's going to play good defense. He's going to give you some buckets. Like he's a really nice piece for this team. Is he going to fully replicate Matt Bradley? No, probably not. But he's going to give them another punch offensively and defensively, something that they really need after losing the talent that they've lost. You add Dixon Waters to Trammell and Butler, that's a really good backcourt. Is it an NCAA tournament national championship backcourt? I'm inclined to say no, but you know what? At this time last year, I would have looked at San Diego State's backcourt and said, no, that's not a national championship backcourt either. And they did it. So I wouldn't rule it out. Dixon Waters, again, he's experienced. He's been in college for many years. He's been in the NCAA tournament multiple times. Like, those are the kind of players that you want on your roster when you get into March. And so I think this is a really solid above average addition for Dutcher, one that hasn't gotten a ton of attention, but one that I think is really going to pay off for the Aztecs. They also had Jay Powell from Campbell. Powell as a 6'9" forward. He's kind of their Mensa Johnson replacement as much as he's capable of being. He averaged 12.3 points and 7 boards last year for Campbell. How he does moving up a level into the Mountain West, more physical, tougher, more difficult, just top to bottom in that conference. We'll see what that looks like for Powell. But if he can be a kind of enforcer for them, a good rebounder, a good low post scorer, that's going to really help make this team not so reliant on the backcourt. They also add a couple of 2023 players as well. Miles Heady, who is a unranked center from the class of 2023, and BJ Davis, a 3-star point guard, who is 154th in the class of 2023, according to 24/7 Sports' rankings. So the main question, are the Aztecs going to repeat? Are they going to be able to do what they did last year? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It's hard to see also. I don't know that I could really project this team at this point. They lost. Bradley's a tough loss. Johnson's a tough loss. Mensa's a tough loss. Seiko's a tough loss. All 4 of those guys were really critical pieces to what this team did. Getting Lamont Butler back helps tremendously. He can do a little bit of everything. He's rarely going to be a 20-point per game guy. He's probably not even going to be your leading scorer most nights, but he's going to get assists. He's going to distribute the basketball. He's going to get rebounds. He's going to get steals. He's going to play all Mountain West caliber defense because he's been that 2 years in a row. And that plus Trammell plus Dixon Waters is not a guard room that I want to play. It's not a guard room that even a lot of Power 5 teams don't have a 3-man guard rotation that is as good as that. A lot of teams in the Power 5 don't. And I think that that's going to help this team tremendously. I don't think they have as much oomph in the front court, having lost Mensa and Johnson. And I think that's where, if there is any future additions to come, if there are players in the portal that Dutcher and company think can really help them in the front court, if they can find those guys, or even find guys who played smaller roles last year and kind of develop them up into those bigger roles, then suddenly you're looking at a team that, yeah, maybe they are top 15 throughout the season, top 20. Maybe they do get a 3 or a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. Maybe they can make another deep run. I wouldn't rule it out by any stretch of the imagination. I still think there's some work to do, work to be done, but getting Lamont Butler back, really nice step for this team. Well, we're going to close out the show discussing Johni Broome, who could be among the nation's best centers at Auburn next season. More on him coming up right after this. All right, segment 3 here, 3 up, 3 down. We're talking about 3 different players who have made the decision to return to college basketball for the 2023-24 season. We led off the show talking about Ryan Kalkbrenner, the 2-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year, returning for the Creighton Blue Jays. We talked about Lamont Butler, who had one of the best shots in NCAA tournament history last year for the Aztecs of San Diego State. He is back to help that team try to run it back. And now we're going to close out the show talking about Johni Broome from Auburn. Broome averaged 14.2 points per game last year, 8.5 rebounds, and 2.4 blocks as a junior. He has 2 years of eligibility remaining. For the record, all three of these guys have 2 years of eligibility remaining because they have that extra COVID year. I'm not sure any of them are going to use it, but that is a question we can answer next off season. For now, they're all coming back. Broome joins an Auburn team that is kind of running it back with a lot of the same players. Their guard rotation of Wendell Green, of KD Johnson, of Zep Jasper, all three of those guys are projected to come back. None of them have entered the transfer portal. None of them are out of eligibility. So if all three of those guys come back, and then look, there's some questions about Auburn's guard rotation. There were last year, there were even 2 years ago about some of these same guys of can they be consistent enough? Can they hit enough shots? Are they going to continue to shoot us out of games, which is something we have seen these guys do in the past? Or are we going to see growth? Are we going to see some more experience kind of allow them to be better versions of the basketball players that they have been under Bruce Pearl up to this point? Because if all three of those guys steadily continue to improve, and then you get Broome coming back in a season where he could legitimately be an All-American caliber player, I don't think that's that bold of a take. Do I think he's going to be first team? No. But if you told me right now that Brome's going to be an All-American third teamer next year, that wouldn't shock me. It really wouldn't. Kalkbrenner is the kind of player he's going to be competing with in that kind of award. Of course, it depends on Zach Edey, Oscar Tshiebwe. If both those guys come back suddenly, the room for centers to be on those kind of teams dwindles a little bit. But Broome is that. Look what he did in the NBA draft combine. He was one of the players many people were talking about of like he stunned a lot of people. He showed up really well. He played extremely well against really high caliber opponents, and his game just doesn't really translate all that well to the NBA right now. He's 55% on 2-pointers last year, but he's only 29% from three. And we talked about this with Kalkbrenner. When you see a guy with a low 3-point percentage, you feel more optimistic when you see how they do at the free throw line. Kalkbrenner is about 80% from the free throw line. Broome is about 56. So I think the optimism around him becoming the kind of floor spacer that the modern NBA basically requires from their starting centers, it's not quite there. Part of the reason he comes back, maybe he can improve on that. If he comes back, shoots 68% from the free throw line, 34% from deep, that helps his draft stock significantly, especially if he then goes into the combine again next year, shows those skills in game settings there. Like, there's a lot of optimism that Broome could be a guy who finds himself in the NBA eventually. And he looked like it this combine process, but instead he comes back to the Tigers, which I think is a fun decision for him. I think it's exciting to see what he could do with another year of college basketball with that same kind of group. Again, they're returning Johnson, they returned Jasper, they returned Wendell Green, they returned Jalen Williams, who was a 6'8" forward for them, who was very productive as kind of that small ball 4 role for this team. And really, Auburn didn't lose a ton of players who immediately contributed to last year's roster. That's the best way to put it. The biggest loss from last year's roster is Alan Flanagan. Flanagan is in the transfer portal. He has not committed anywhere yet. He was about 10 points per game for this team last year. They did have 2 other players they lost that I'm sure Auburn fans would like to have back. That's Johan Traore and Chance Westry. Both guys were top 40 prospects in their class, but neither of them averaged more than 3 points per game last year. Traore was 2.1, Westry was 2.5. So they were guys that you wanted to see develop. You wanted to see them grow within the system, potentially get better. Traore, there was a ton of optimism and enthusiasm around him when he first committed to Auburn. He had a great performance during their international trip last year. And then it just didn't happen for him during the regular season. He has now transferred to join Joe Pasternak at UC Santa Barbara in the Big West, which looks like a huge step down for Traore on paper. I would caution anybody to point out that UC Santa Barbara is a really good basketball team and a team that's going to be in the NCAA tournament most likely for the next couple of years of Traore's career. Westry ended up staying a little closer to Auburn and just went up the road to Syracuse, where he is going to play in the first year post-Jim Boeheim era for the Orange with Red Autry there. But if you're Auburn and you have your backcourt back, you have your small ball starter back in Jalen Williams, and you get Broome back, like, you got to be feeling pretty darn good about where you're at. And we haven't even talked about their additions. 2 really big-time additions joining Bruce Pearl and the Tigers next season. First up, Aiden Holloway, a class of 2023 point guard, 5-star guard, number 17 in the class. He's coming out of prolific prep. This is a huge addition to the backcourt. A really big-time recruit for Auburn to land. Auburn landing top 20 recruits is a big deal. This is a big thing that's happening for the Tigers. A very exciting player to come into the program. And then they also add Denver Jones. Denver Jones out of Florida International University last year, so mid-major guy coming all the way up to the SEC, but he averaged 20 last year. There's not a lot of dudes in college basketball who scored 20 a game last year, and if you can get a guy like that on your team, even if they're coming from a smaller level, I know people have concerns. How is this going to translate? Most dudes who drop 20 per game in college basketball can play at the Division I level. I don't think that's that particularly hot of a take. Have there been players who have struggled? Yes, of course. But to me, Denver Jones is the kind of guy who comes up, he gets a chance to play in this backcourt, 6'4" guard, a little bit, he's 37% three-point shooter, so he's got the right size. He's maybe a little small for the SEC. I think that's one question that I would have is how does that size translate for him? But a guy who he's a gunner, three-point shooter, 37%, like we said, a scorer, 20 points per game. He didn't just do that from beyond the arc. He can also get to the rim, finish through contact, do all that stuff. You add that and Aiden Holloway, a top 20 recruit in the class. You add that to a backcourt that, again, has Jasper, has Johnson, has Wendell Green. Now you have 5 guys who can kind of rotate into those spots. If any of those 3 guys are struggling, which we know historically they kind of do sometimes, you have options to replace them. I think this is a really good backcourt for Auburn, for Bruce Pearl, and you get Williams back, and now you get Broome back, and all of a sudden, like, this team's running it back with more talent than they had last year. More talent than they had last year on this team. I wouldn't be surprised to see Auburn contending for a spot in the bottom half of the top 25 preseason at this point. For all these teams, I think Kalkbrenner coming back is the biggest difference maker for Creighton because they had nothing behind him, and I think it would be a really big challenge if they didn't have him going into next year. But Broome coming back for Auburn is huge too because this team had all the pieces already. They had the guards, they had the wings, they just needed to get the big man back, the guy who averaged 14 and 8 last year. Him coming back solidifies this team as a potential top 25 team and a team that can really legitimately challenge to be the winner in the SEC next year. There's a lot of talent. Kentucky, they don't look like they're going to be Kentucky necessarily. We'll talk more about that later this week when we find out what's going on with Oscar Tshiebwe, what's going on with Antonio Reeves. But that's a team that's really relying on a young recruiting class. And of course, Calipari has done it with young kids in the past, but these COVID kids, there's a lot of questions about how good the class of 2023 actually is going to be. Calipari is really relying on it. I'm not sure about them. Alabama, hard to replace a Noah Clowney and a Brandon Miller, and Charles Bediako leaves as well. So the door's kind of open for Auburn to potentially be an SEC challenger for the number 1 spot in that conference, and getting Broome back and having this guard rotation the way that it is. There's a lot of optimism for me about what Auburn could be next season. On that note, we are going to close out today's episode of the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. We will have more NBA draft declaration conversation coming later this week. We'll speak with the great Leaf Tulane on Wednesday's episode, and we'll look Thursday, Friday. Isaac Shade will be back with you guys to talk about the final decisions that were made, the players who waited until the last possible minute to decide whether they're going to come back to school or hit the draft and what that means for college basketball next season. Go hit that subscribe button on YouTube if you have not done so yet. Follow us on Twitter. You can also leave a review for the podcast on iTunes if you would like. More fantastic draft-related content coming your way later this week. For now, peace out.